you've just finished a cross-stitch piece, so yay! But it's maybe looking a bit crumpled and maybe even has some dirty marks on it. So let's talk about how you can spruce it up, ready for finishing in a way that's safe for your delicate cross-stitch. And importantly, whether you even need to do this, and those situations where you might not want to. Hi there, Stitchy friends. I'm Kat from Catkin and Lily, bringing you the best tips, tricks and tutorials so you can get the most joy from your cross-stitching. If you've been wondering whether it's worth washing and pressing your finished cross-stitch pieces before you finish them up, then yes it is. Absolutely, 100%, always. Okay, mostly always. Because you know me, I'm not about hard and fast rules. And actually this is one case where there are certain exceptions and times when you might not want to do this. Now, if we're talking about a really tiny cross-stitch piece that maybe hasn't taken me very long to stitch, so I haven't been touching it all that much, then I might skip washing it. I'm just telling it how it is. But I will always iron it, because I do find that no matter how small the piece, how short a time I've been stitching on it, it's going to have creases and it will look better if it's ironed. But if it's something that is a larger piece, particularly if it's something that I want to put on display or give as a gift, then absolutely, apart from those exceptions that I mentioned earlier, I am going to wash and press it because it simply will look so much better. I guess I just feel that if you've spent so much love, time and effort on creating a beautiful piece of cross-stitch art, then it's really worth spending just that little bit extra time to make it look absolutely fabulous for however you want to finish it. Now, if you have any visible dirt or marks on your fabric when you finish the piece, which particularly can happen if you've been using an embroidery hoop to hold the fabric, then washing it is probably a little bit of a no-brainer. But even if you can't see any dirt or marks, then your hands will often have invisible oils or dirt on them that can transfer to the fabric or your threads as you're cross-stitching. So it's still a really good idea to wash it. So if you do have any dirt or oils on the fabric, even if you can't see it, that could cause the threads or fabric to deteriorate over time, which might not be something you're worried about, and that's absolutely fine. I do also find though that washing and pressing is really good for getting creases out, and that will make your work look so much more professional. And the final benefit to washing in particular, but also the ironing, is it just kind of plumps up the threads a bit, makes your stitches just look much fuller and nicer, makes those colours really as bright as they absolutely can be. So again, just makes it look absolutely top notch. And I reckon it's a really good idea to wash and press your work when you've finished it, even if you're not actually going to finish it straight away. Even if you're just going to pop it away, store it in a drawer or a cupboard. In fact, maybe even more so, because if you came back to a piece that you've stored and it's got creases or dirt on it, it's going to be even harder to shift at that point. So if you wash it and press it first and then store it away, then it'll be much easier when you come back to it if you want to finish it up. And by the way, I want to say it is absolutely okay if you want to pop those finished pieces away because you don't know what you want to do with them yet, or maybe you just really enjoyed stitching it, but actually you don't feel the need to put it on display. That's absolutely fine. So once I have my washed and pressed piece of cross stitch, then I like to place it between layers of acid-free tissue paper. So this one's quite small, so I've just popped it on a piece and folded that over the top. And then I'm going to take a cardboard tube, so something like the inside from a roll of wrapping paper or kitchen paper is perfect. And then I'm just going to place the tube at one end, roll it round, roll it all the way up, and then I'll just use some paper tape, take a small piece and just tape it down like that. Now for a longer roll you could put a few more pieces, but it'll just keep it in place, and that will keep your stitching nice and clean, crease free, until you want to do something with it. Okay, before we move on to looking at how to actually wash and press your finished pieces, I want to talk about those situations I mentioned earlier where you might not want to wash your piece. And that's basically in situations where you think that the threads or fabric that you've used might not be colour fast, so there's a risk that the colour could run out of the threads or fabric when you put it into water. And that's obviously something you do not want. So if you've used any hand-dyed threads or hand-dyed fabric or printed fabric, then it's often recommended that you don't wash these because they may well not be colour fast. The other thing is if you have beads or embellishments on your fabric, they may not appreciate being soaked in water, but you could always wash the piece when you finish the cross stitching and then add the beads and embellishments afterwards. Now, I think this is probably one of the biggest reasons that cross stitchers are worried about washing their finished piece, is that risk of the colour running out. Usually from the threads, but potentially from the fabric as well, particularly if there are darker colours. Some colours of threads are particularly prone to the colour running out, so anything in the kind of red or pink category, that can often be a little bit more of a risk, and also with unbranded threads. Now, I have never had any colour run with using DMC threads, which is a big reason why I like to use DMC threads as much as possible. And I think the thought of dropping your finished piece into water and seeing the colour run out is pretty terrifying. I can understand why that would put people off. But there is actually a way that you can test first to see if it's going to be a problem, and then you can decide if it is a problem that you don't wash the finished piece. So the first way that you could do that is to take some small offcuts of your threads and potentially a piece of your fabric as well, and just drop those into a small amount of water and see if the colour runs out. The other way is to take a damp white cloth and just press it gently onto your stitches and onto the fabric. Just press it very gently, don't press it down in lots of places and move it around. Just press it on and lift it off and have a look to see, has anything come up on the cloth? Again, in which case, could be a little bit of a problem. So let's talk washing your cross stitch piece. And I'm going to show you how I do it, but I wanted to talk generally about it first. And washing your cross stitch really is very easy. You just need a clean sink or bowl, a mild washing liquid, and a towel. Now, my first piece of advice here is if you want to wash multiple pieces of work at the same time, do them all individually in a fresh bowl of water. And that way, if something unexpected happens, then you've only ruined one piece of work, which is still not fun, but at least you haven't ruined multiple pieces if they were all in together. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is what you use to actually wash your cross stitch pieces. Because you are going to want to use some kind of washing liquid, some kind of detergent, because water on its own isn't likely to shift those invisible oils and dirt that we talked about earlier. But you really want to avoid using any harsh chemicals, so that can even include things like hand wash liquid for clothes or wool wash liquids like Woolite, because they can actually have some chemicals in there that could cause the threads or fabric to deteriorate slightly, and they can often leave residue on it. It can be quite hard to rinse them out properly, and again, that could cause some deterioration over time. All you need is something very mild, a very mild hand soap or washing up liquid. The absolute ideal is to look for something that is uncoloured, unfragranced, no harsh chemicals. Now, I'm in the UK and my preferred brand for this is the Ecover Zero, and I'll pop a link to that below if you want to see that, but something along those lines will be absolutely perfect and will be as gentle as it possibly can be for your delicate cross stitch. So I'm all set up here to wash my cross stitch pattern, and here we go. It is a bit seasonal, this one. It is coming up to Halloween here in the UK as I'm filming this, so it's a Halloween pattern, and it's a fairly small one, so probably took about 10 or 12 hours to stitch. So obviously I've not been holding onto it for too long, but you can see it's got some creases on it, so obviously want to make it look really nice. So I'm using a bowl in my sink. You want a clean bowl or a clean sink, and then I'm going to use this Ecover washing up liquid. So this is the Zero, so it's got no fragrance, no colouring, absolutely nothing. So it's perfect. And for a bowl this size and a small pattern, I'm only going to need a few drops. So I'm literally just going to put a tiny little bit in there. And then I'm going to run the water to get the temperature that I want. So I'm going to pull this down. I'm going to start running this because I want to use lukewarm or even cold water, because that will help to reduce the risk of any colour running. And it also avoids removing too much starch from the fabric, which can leave it really floppy. So that's perfect. It's just off of cold. So let's add some into here. Now the reason I haven't put too much soap into there is because if you add too much soap, then it can get really, really soapy and you're going to spend ages trying to rinse it out, or maybe not even get it all rinsed out and have some soapy residue on your pattern. So I've got my soapy water there. I'm going to take my pattern and I'm just going to press it into the fabric, into the water, sorry. So pop that in there so it's all covered, and I can leave it there, leave it to soak for about 15 minutes. Now the recommendations for how long to leave it do vary, but it really doesn't need ages. You don't really want to leave it in there for a few hours, but you probably want more than a couple of minutes. Now, if you have any obvious stains on the fabric, you could, at this point, rub those very gently with a soft toothbrush, but of course you do need to be super gentle. So my cross stitch has had about 15 minutes or so to soak in the water there. So the next thing I'm going to do is just give it a bit of a swish around in the water. And this will just help to shake free any dirt or oils that have loosened while it's been soaking. So give that a good old swish. Okay, then I'm going to lift that out. We can tip away that soapy water, and then we need to rinse. You can see there is some soap on here, and obviously we don't want any of that left on here. So I'm going to set my tap to cold. And I'm just rinsing it. So I'm just going to turn it all round. Give it a really good rinse through. Rinse it front and back. So that's completely rinsed. I'm sure all my soap's been removed. And of course it is dripping wet right now. So the temptation is to squeeze this to remove any excess water, but don't do it. This will leave you with more creases to iron out afterwards, and it could squash or distort your stitching. So instead, give it a little shake, and then you can see I've got a towel here ready, and I'm just going to take it and pop it straight onto the towel. So I've got a clean, dry, light coloured towel, and then I'm going to take this and fold it over the top. Compress that down lightly, and I will just leave it like that to dry. Now if you want, you can roll the towel up to sort of help to get out any excess water, but honestly you can just leave it to dry like this. It's absolutely fine. Okay, so now we're ready to press the design. This is completely dried, and you can press it once it's completely dried or while it's still slightly damp. And it can be helpful to do it while it's still slightly damp, because it will help to get those creases out. You can see, obviously I've still got creases in here. I have also heard that ironing it whilst damp could cause the colours to run, even if they were okay with the washing process. And I guess that's because when you're ironing it, there's some more heat involved. I have to say I've never had a problem with that, but I do like a little dampness in the fabric. So if it's completely dry, like this one, then what I like to do is just to use, I've got an empty bottle with a spritz on the top, and I like to give it a bit of a spritz with water, and it just adds a little bit of dampness back in again. But as I say, ideally I would do this probably when it's slightly damp, but it has dried, so that's the alternative. And then obviously the most important thing here is that I've turned my work over. So I've popped it on a nice clean towel and I've put it face down. You really only want to be pressing the back of your work and not your stitches on the front, because that would squash them. The other thing you can do at this point is to use a thin cloth to place over the top of your work while you press it on the back. So if I place that over there, I've got a pillowcase. You could use a tea towel as long as it's light coloured and thin, because you want something that will protect your work but won't stop the heat going through and the fabric getting properly pressed. I've got my iron and I've got that heating up. Now I've got my temperature setting actually fairly warm. I find that I tend to put it on almost as hot as I would do for clothes, but I've turned my steam function off. Now you can, if your fabric's a little bit damp or you've spritzed it like I have, then you don't really need to use your steam setting. I find that's probably a little bit too much for the fabric. Now the recommendations on how hot to have your iron do seem to vary quite a lot. Some say use a very cool iron, some say use a very hot iron. I would say you want something on a medium setting, because if it's too cool, then it's just not going to work. It's not going to press your fabric and get those creases out. But obviously you don't want it too hot. So start with it lower and work up to where you find a good temperature is for you. So now we need to start to press this. And what I like to do is to put my iron on top, and I'll just sort of slowly move it around, even picking it up and putting it back down again. You don't want to move the iron around really fast. If you drag the iron around over your work, then it's potentially going to pull at the fabric and threads and distort them. So as long as it's not too hot, I'm not going to worry if the iron sits there for a moment. I know my temperature setting is okay. So I'm going to work that round. It can take a little while. Okay, I'm going to have a peek and see how it's doing. Now I can see, even from the back there, I can see there's still some creases in the fabric just around here. And this is where actually, once you've done some with the pressing cloth on top, I actually find it more useful to remove it and iron directly onto the fabric, because sometimes those creases just aren't going to come out with the cloth on top. It's a good idea to start with that, but then I'm going to bring my iron back in. And again, I'm going to do the same. I'm just moving it. I'm even letting it rest gently. Now, one time you might not want to iron is, or certainly be more careful if you're going to iron, is if you use metallic threads, because the heat could make them shrink or melt. Now I have got, in this design, there are just some DMC Etoile threads. The amount of metallic in there is not going to be a problem. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So I'm going to turn it over and see what I think. I've got a bit of fluff on it. That is looking pretty good. I feel like it could be just slightly flatter where the design is. So I'm actually just going to come back in and rest my iron on here. So as I say, if your iron's not too hot, you really can just rest the iron on it. And then let's have a look. Yeah, I think that is looking spooktacular. Sorry, I couldn't resist. So I hope that's shown you just how simple it is to wash and iron your finished cross stitch pieces and how lovely it will make them look. But if it isn't something that you want to spend time on, then I'm not here to tell you that you should be doing it. It's really about what makes you happiest. So where do you stand on this? Is it something you always do, something you never do, or like me, something that you sometimes do? I'm really interested to know, so do let me know in the comments, particularly if anything I've said has changed your mind. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, then it would be absolutely awesome if you would give it a thumbs up, maybe share it with someone that you think would find it helpful, and of course subscribe to stay in the loop for all the good stitchy tips and tutorials that I have planned. Thank you so much for watching, and happy stitching!